Les, welcome aboard to the show. So happy to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Les, you grew up in an interesting time of history. I'd like to kind of send you back many years and describe to us the environment, the pain. What pushed you to become, and would it be fair to call you to a certain degree, an activist?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I was almost destined in that direction based on my family's history. My parents were working class people who fled Germany. I grew up on a chicken farm in South Jersey, uh, southern part of New Jersey, and discussions about fairness and justice were just part of the upbringing. I mean, we were German Jewish immigrants, very worried. We were in a town with where we were a small minority, very worried about being discriminated against and whether bad things would happen to us. So I was leaning in that direction already. I found more of my footing when I went to college. I went to Oberlin College, and there were a lot of other people there. The Vietnam War was starting to rage, and protests were just part of our DNA. But there was there was a real tension though between being an activist and finding meaning in life. There was a sense where I was good at organizing, I was bad at writing. Or at least I thought I was bad at writing. I think I was a little dyslexic. I couldn't spell. I was very fearful of writing. I somehow managed to, every now and then I have flashes of near genius, but very small flashes. So I kind of went through, I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I really didn't know how I could contribute. I was very worried about never being able to find a job. I then fell in, continued to organize. I got involved in peace campaigns. Uh, Gene McCarthy running for president in 1968, and then a guy named Joe Duffy running for Senate in Connecticut in 1970, a campaign in which I met Bill Clinton and others who were deeply involved in this campaign. Again, I was very good at organizing, but there was something about it that was unfulfilling. But I then went to graduate school. I worked at a college for a while, and I went to graduate school. I still thought I wanted to be an activist, but I wanted to be in a more intellectual environment. And so with some people, we created this thing called the Labor Institute. But I couldn't, again, I didn't feel like I could make a contribution as much as I could make an organizational one. So I kind of, helped run the place and ran around and did all kinds of stuff. And I had a mentor, a guy named Tony Mazzocchi, who was a very unusual labor leader, very radical, very pro-environment. If you've seen the movie Silkwood, he's the person that really she was coming to visit. He was who basically founded the occupational health and safety movement, and he really wanted to rebuild the labor movement. He was kind of my guru. And once again, I was his ghostwriter a little bit, but I was sort of his organizational backbone. Somehow we kept this institute alive, and we were involved in some marvelous campaigns like a plant closing in Bruce Springsteen's hometown, where we got Bruce Springsteen involved. We got the South African workers who from the same company, 3M, involved. It was great thing, but it was just organizational burnout, one after the other after the other. And I remember I got married, we had a family. And I remember, it must have been about 2002 or 2003. I was visiting, we were staying at this little cabin near Yellowstone, and I was visiting the people who own the cabin. And the dad uh, was a doctor, a retired doctor at the Indian Health Service in Alaska. And I asked him uh, how he liked his job. He said he loved it. And I had this flash. I realized I didn't love my job. And I was very worried. My dad hated his jobs. And I was very worried that my kids would see their dad hating his work. So what I said to myself quietly, never talked to my wife about it. I said, I'm giving myself 5 more years at what I'm doing now. And if I can't say I love it, I'm leaving. And I don't know what I'm going to do, but I don't want to be an unhappy father trying to, just go through the motions. Well, the world kind of turned upside down. Turned out that my mentor got pancreatic cancer. He lasted about a year. I interviewed him like nonstop for over a year, and then I wrote a biography about him. And that the process of writing that book was an absolutely out of body experience. I would get up in the morning, help the kids get to school. I would then start writing, researching, writing, listening to the tapes, et cetera, et cetera. It would be 3 o'clock before I would look up again. Sometimes the kids were standing on a corner waiting for me to take them to soccer practice or whatever. I'd finally show up. And it was like this day after day. I can't tell you I can finally say I love what I'm doing. And it was an incredibly positive experience. The book was basically wrote itself. People talk about, how hard it is to write and how difficult it is for them. And I know what they were talking about, but that wasn't me anymore. Of course, computers with spell check took the worry out of being dyslexic about spelling. But I just started to write, and I realized this is what I want to do. I didn't give up the activism because I'm writing about activism basically, but I realized writing books is what I wanted to do. I write Substack pieces as well, but it's really the books that are the biggest challenge. And trying to have something to say and making a coherent argument for several hundred pages, and then going through the whole process of editing and rewriting, and it was just an incredible thing. I've one of the things about writing, I would start a new chapter, and then when I get back to it the next day, I'd start at the beginning of that chapter. So I end up rewriting the beginning of chapters like 5 times because I couldn't get to the end. But all of that was joy. And the first time in my life I could say I really love what I'm doing, and I feel blessed because 7 books later, I'm still at it. I'm thinking about the next one, and I can't help myself. Does it make any difference in the world? That's the tough question. I'm small potatoes. I don't get reviewed in the New York Times. Does it have an impact? Like you get feedback from the people who listen to your stuff or read your stuff. And, I think some of the books, I think all the books have had a positive impact. Whether it's earth shaking or not, I would be hard to make that claim, about any book really, but especially, about the ones that I'm writing. But I think it makes a contribution. It's the old Bobby Kennedy thing. You're tossing a pebble into a lake and you're making ripples. We all have to try to do that if we want to create a better world. So that's really my story. That's kind of how I transformed from being a operational, administrative, organizer type person to a writer, and I hope in some ways a useful public intellectual.
I'm a firm believer that thinking through ideas, having public discourse, bringing people together is a positive thing to do in the world. It's I don't know if this has been true over 70 years. I'm relatively young, but it seems that there's less of that happening together. Despite the ease of us to communicate, it seems that it's really created these echo chambers. So I think writing books and thinking through your own ideas and their logic in general is a positive thing that I definitely support. I wanted to go back to difficult time and ask a little bit about what that time looked like. You mentioned your family fleeing Nazi Germany. How old were you? What did that look like from a first-hand perspective?
I was born in the States. I was born in 47. They came over in 38. They started to come. My mother was the operator in all this. They she's as soon as Hitler took power, she started the process of getting the family to leave, and she had 4 brothers and sisters and her parents, and it took from 1933 all the way to 1938 to kind of get them all in motion. Their journeys were very, very different. My father's brother never left. And I edited his diaries, and that's one of the books that I put out about his incredible uh, task of survival in the middle of Germany. I I was lucky. I grew up, my parents took the worst of this. Uh, I picked up a lot of their fear, but in a way, I was the golden boy. I didn't look Jewish. I had blonde hair, blue eyes, uh, uh, and I never experienced. In truth, I experienced very, very little anti-Semitism my entire life. Just didn't experience it hardly at all. But our environment, there was a fear of authority that I have, really, I have probably never overcome myself. My parents were petrified that something bad would happen to was just around the corner. I tell this funny story, at least to me it's funny. My late in-laws are Polish Catholics, lovely people. We went to a Milwaukee Brewers game and people were drinking all around us. And in New York, when I went to baseball games, when people start drinking, fights usually break out. So I'm thinking, a fight's about to break out. Another pogrom is about to happen in front of my very eyes. And my mother-in-law turns to her husband and says, geez, aren't they having a good time? And I really, their take of the world was so much more positive than what the environment I grew up in was very fearful, very negative. And, it shaped me, but it also made me very sensitive to, I think gave me a lot of empathy for people who had difficulties in society. And I think that shaped my politics.
I appreciate you sharing that story. Thank you. You mentioned the Bruce Springsteen 3M story, factory shutting down. That sounds like such an interesting story. Would you mind sharing it?
Wow, there's a lot to that one, both personal and broader. That particular local was in the same union as my mentor, the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers. And the president of that local was a guy named Stanley Fisher, a very bright and sort of gutsy guy. So we had worked with him on and off doing educational programs. And so we knew each other pretty well. He came in to our office and he said, look, we're facing a shutdown and Bruce Springsteen's hometown. And he wrote a song, My Hometown, about a plant shutdown. We want to get him to support our effort to keep the plant open. And I'm going, you got to be kidding. He said, no, I want you to write a letter to Springsteen telling the story and see if he responds. So, and here's, Landau is his agent. So I wrote a letter and they responded. So we went in to see them. I came in dressed like, dressed up. And of course, we're walking into a rock star's office and they're all, dressed in t-shirts and whatever. But, we got along. We met Springsteen. He got interested in the campaign, but he would only get involved if we found one other rock star to be part of it. And we were able to get through another connection that I had. We got Willie Nelson. So we had Willie Nelson and Bruce Springsteen. So that was a nice combination. Then this guy, Stanley Fisher, he says, I want to connect with the South African fem workers and see if we can connect with them. And so he dumps that on me. So I went through a bunch of different trade union connections, and we've got a hold of the union that represented those workers. And the woman who was the head of that union was in New York seeking medical attention and visiting her daughter. And she wasn't seeing anybody. And I sort of begged, and et cetera. I said, look, can I take you home from the hospital to your daughters? And can we talk then? And she said, yes. And we talked, and she connected me to a guy named Eamon Masani, who was the head of the workers in South Africa. And they decided to go on a half-day strike. We got it videoed. We got the video. We had sent them T-shirts that had Bruce Springsteen slogans, song titles on the front and the back. They wore them. We had to smuggle that in via one of the Rockefeller Foundation, Rockefeller daughters, smuggled that in. And then we got the tape smuggled out. And we got it on ABC News. And then we got ABC 2020 to do a whole series on this. It turned out to be 40 minutes long. Became a huge deal. Of course, the plant was still shut down, but the workers got, more benefits out of it. Bruce Springsteen did a little, at the Stone Pony, did a little benefit concert from it. And I started to, this is where, from my perspective, I was burning out because given the time differences between South Africa and us, I was working 24 hours to try to keep up with this. And again, it was this almost pure organizational work. And to keep myself sane, I started writing the story. My first attempt to try to write a book. And what happened is both great and sad. I talked to the Springsteen assistant manager, Barbara Carr, and she says, yeah, please go ahead. And every morning before I start with all this craziness, and it was nonstop craziness. The guy from South Africa came over. He was black. He got arrested when he came back in. He was in prison. We had to get him out. It was just nonstop craziness. So I start writing for a couple hours. And so they said, hey, send it to our agent, Springsteen's operations agent. And she gets it. I have a couple of chapters and she reads it and she goes, you're a really good writer, but we can't let you publish this. It's too revealing. I was like crestfallen, and I just put it aside. P.S. 6 months later, I run into Barbara Carr. She goes, "How's the book going?" I said, "I stopped writing it because your agent that you told me to see told me I can't do it." She said, "Oh, you should come right to me. That's ridiculous." So it was too late. It might have been a year later. It was too late to tell the story. So I missed my opportunity to become a best-selling author because, about Springsteen at that particular point, would have sold. Anyway, but it got me into thinking, hey, maybe I can write. So, and we did do some good for the workers. And I think, we did some good for the South Africans as well. But it was a tiger by the tail. It was whipping me around. And it's just a warning to anybody who wants to do organizational work. You've got to have a lot of stamina, and you better like it because it doesn't quit on you.
Yeah. I experience where company basically shut down. I asked for management for some help to basically help each and every employee find their next. I didn't get shit, but I worked for almost a month to help them. This is modern day, so build your resume, your brand, your LinkedIn, social media, reach out. I actually got quite a few interviews set up for the team, but it's not except for emotionally. There's no rewards for this kind of work. Difficult. You mentioned that the factory ultimately shut down. I wanted to, as a segue to companies and business and economics, I wanted to ask the question: why was the factory being shut down? What was the issue? Was there a chance in hell to prevent it, or was this just about it not forgetting the workers, the employees?
It's a really good question. And I wish I knew what I know now. I wish I knew then. It was interesting. 3M was not one of the companies that was getting decimated when interest rates went up and stagflation, the whole wiping out of the industrial base really of the country. 3M was doing very well. And ironically, that facility in Freehold, New Jersey was producing the high quality tape used in recording studios. So, but I think they had overcapacity. So they more or less were expanding another plant in Minnesota or someplace else. They just didn't need to have two. Uh, could they have kept the plant open? Yeah, they were wealthy enough to do that. But the alternative, and the one that I'm really thinking about now that I didn't think about then, was they should have gone to we should have been pressing for no compulsory layoffs. If you want to lay off people, you've got to buy them out. You're a wealthy company. You do this with your white collar employees all the time. You want to reduce the footprint here, offer voluntary buyout. And that means you're going to have to keep something going in this plant. I came upon this notion. I didn't think this was real until I started working on the last book. That's the other great thing about working on a book. Not only do you think out arguments better, but you find out that the argument that you used to have was wrong. You could try something else. So I interviewed this head of international organizing for the IG Metall, the largest union in Germany. And he was involved in Siemens. And Siemens had shut down, but was laying off like 7,000 people across the country, 1,700 in the United States, 3,000 in Germany. And all the ones in the United States were let go. In Germany, they really fought it. And so I figured, Germany is going to be high social wage. They probably got, money to go to school and relocation allowances, et cetera. So I talked to him, and it turns out that's not what happened at all. What happened was there were 5 plants that were going to go down. 5, not 1, 5. And they did this whole fact-finding thing and had all these experts come in, and they control half the seats on the board of directors, not the final vote. Final vote, the chair is the tie-breaking vote. But they brought all this evidence in, and they finally convinced Siemens to only lay off people voluntarily, that they had to provide a package. And then, people who wanted to retire early could take that package, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody was forced to go. And this was the kicker. In those 5 facilities, they put in a new product and kept all 5 plants open. So them could have definitely done that. They could have, if they wanted to reduce their footprint, they could have said, okay, we're offering X amount of dollars if you leave voluntarily. Okay, now the workforce goes from 700 to 300. for those 300, we're going to have this kind of operation in Freehold, New Jersey, and keep the facility open until such time that we offer more buyouts. It could have been done. It would have cost some profits, and Siemens in Germany was willing to forego some profits. In the United States, it's very interesting that there was no fight back in terms of the government didn't try and step in and say, hey, you're doing this in Germany, why don't you do it here? No. Instead, I know you don't want to get into politics, but it blew my mind that they invited the head of Siemens USA to the infrastructure signing bill in the White House with 10 other people, only 10 other people. The president of Siemens USA is there as she laid off 1,700 people in the United States involuntarily. And I thought, ay, what's wrong with this picture? Anyway, I learned that there was an alternative to what happened at 3M, and I'm pushing that alternative now.
Yeah, I actually worked for Siemens for 8 years, or at least the companies that were acquired by them. They had here in the States a voluntary, and they ended up actually losing more people than they wanted, so they had to claw back the program and say, no, we still need you guys. Like this is more than we wanted to kind of cut costs, and the package that they gave was obvious, I guess, in retrospect, a little too good. So people were like, oh, I should do that. So it actually got clawed back at some stage when they kind of had enough. So they didn't want to lose as many people. I mean, I wanna play the devil's advocate as I promised at the beginning. Are companies, what is driving these massive layoffs? Is it companies are overhiring? Should they hire slower? Is it that they're going on these investment adventures that just don't pan out and they think they're going to make a whole bunch of money and they don't? And then they get hit with that and the employees, the workers get hit. Is this an unfortunate kind of evil that we just have to deal with? How do we think about this? Because I'm thinking, well, maybe those people shouldn't have been hired from the get-go. But then I'm thinking, well, is it better for them to be have had hired and then fired, and for them to have invested at all than not invest? Like, how do we wrap our head around this incredibly complicated ecosystem?
You're absolutely correct to say it's a very complicated ecosystem, but there's some basic features of it that we've been ignoring for the last 20, 30 years. The rise of stock buybacks, where a company uses its own funds to go into the marketplace to buy back its own shares and therefore raise the price of the shares in two ways. One, because they have to bid up the price to get somebody to sell it to them. And two, earnings per share automatically go up because you're disappearing the shares that you're buying. And so there are fewer shares in circulation. The earnings per share goes up and the price goes up, even though the company didn't change at all. Somehow you have to pay for that. And there seems to be a remarkable connection between mass layoffs and stock buybacks. The mass layoffs are used to finance the stock buyback. So it's not so much, I would argue that it's less about overhiring and more about, well, how do we finance enriching our biggest shareholders, which include the top CEOs who get most of their money in stock incentives? How do we finance that? And can we get by with fewer workers? Can we consolidate? Can we trim, get rid of production lines that aren't producing high enough rate of return? So I think that's one factor. Another factor is mergers, acquisitions, leverage buyouts. Inevitably, for like a leverage buyout, the leverage is high, as you probably well know. Usually the buying company, the hedge fund or the private equity company is putting up about 10%, borrowing 90%. And then they slap the 90%. The big loan gets put on the company that they're buying, and they have to finance that. Again, the easiest way to finance it is to lay off people.
Let's just break this down because not everyone in our
Okay, sure.
audience
I'm sorry.
is economists. So basically, I look for a company that has very low or no debt, and then I'm saying, okay, I'm going to buy that company, but I'm going to buy that company by actually putting an enormous debt on the company itself. So you're almost buying a company through the company itself, which is ridiculous. So I, as a investor, am maybe putting a small amount of equity, of money, of cash, or I'm taking business loans from the government and finding some other investor actually to invest in this whole operation. So that's basically the idea of leveraged buyouts and what a lot of companies will do in this situation.
If you look at the private corporate debt In other words, you sum up all the debt that corporations have put on themselves. If you go back to the 60s and 70s, there was almost no corporate debt. If they wanted to purchase, and there was purchasing of other companies, they had their own profits that they used to purchase. Then, as deregulation set in and as the government stopped monitoring or policing this very carefully, that it, it skyrocketed. It went slowly, and then it just went up and up and up and up. So this phenomena that you're talking about, buying companies and loading up the company with debt and making the company pay it back. Example I use is if you buy a car with a car loan, you've got to pay it back. But if you buy Hertz or Avis, they pay back the loan. You get the car for free. You get, the company pays back the loan, and that works okay, provided that you generate the income from the company to pay back the loans. When Musk bought Twitter at this outrageous price, the debt service at Twitter went from $50 million a year to $1 billion. It went up 20 times. So when he slashed the workforce, in half virtually, one of the reasons he gave was I've got to pay back the debt that I ran up to buy this company. He didn't use just his own money, you can be sure. So this puts pressure on a high amount of pressure on constantly laying off people. So yes, you describe situations companies do overhire, especially when there's changes in the economy like COVID, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there's an obligation when you hire somebody to try to keep them hired, unless they have done, can't perform, et cetera, or, did something wrong. It's a different story. But these companies, almost all of them, have more than enough. If you can do a stock buyback, you can do a voluntary layoff. If you could put billions of dollars into stock buybacks, you can certainly put, 20 million or 30 million into these buyout packages and reduce your workforce that way. And what that would do is just put a floor. It would make people so much less desperate. Their finances would be, it's hard to believe that half the country doesn't have $400 in the bank to handle an emergency. Ari, can you relate to that? I can't relate to that. I couldn't live that way. And yet half the country lives that way. How can that be? That's because there are no constraints at all on mass layoffs. And therefore there's inevitably a decline. You're desperate to get another job, which means that your wage rates are going to go down over time. And it's certainly not going to go up. It's not a pretty picture. Another discussion we could have about what that does to the whole politics of the United States and what it does to what you were talking about, what we were talking about before about the echo chambers. One of the things that our institute tries to do, and what I try to do, is I want to have discussions with people who do not agree with me. We try to reach working people who are leaning towards Trump or might have voted for Trump. We don't want to just talk to the people who already agree with, our frame of reference. We're trying to share a worldview and put it up for debate. We use this small group training methodology where people have discussions, problem-solving groups where we provide a lot of factual information, which they can use or not use as they see fit. But they do draw their own conclusions. We don't jam anything down their throats, but we want to have that discussion. We want to break through the bubble, the liberal bubble that so many people, on the left are stuck inside of. It's useless. And I think we're all better off, as you said, when we have these discussions. And I look forward to having discussions with the devil advocates. I go out of my way to find them. I would like to be exactly on those kinds of podcasts. Matter of fact, I was interviewed once by Newt Gingrich. That kept me up at night the night before, going, and it turned out it was a great experience. We had a good discussion. He was very open to the stuff I was talking about. He was not nasty. It was like a real thing. I have a very good friend, a very conservative columnist named Mike Walsh. He's a wonderful person. We disagree on a lot of things in sort of contemporary politics, but actually we have a lot of points of agreement overall, and I love the discussion. I love when he hammers me about the last thing I've written. It's just healthy to not get stuck in a rut, and then basically the conversation becomes, who can pass the litmus test? Am I using the right words? Am I using the right concepts? Or am I going to offend somebody in my bubble? We got to break out of that. That's not healthy for democracy. And by the way, it's not healthy for the left either. It's not doing so well. So anyway.
I would argue, this whole Trump for and against debate now going on LinkedIn with the tariffs. Here's my argument. The purpose of having a left and a right is so they fight each other. So they call each other out on their shit. And so any mistakes that are made are fixed. And you have an intelligent debate and you kind of find any kind of corruption. You find a root out bad ideas. That's the reason why we have a two-party system. So for me, it's less about, well, is the left right, is the right right? To me, it's about, well, having that system is what keeps us afloat. And when we look at other countries where suddenly the opposition starts disappearing into, cold forests or just simply die or find themselves in prison or find not to get too political, find their degrees revoked by the university so they can't run for elections. When those things happen, then it's like the system that we love is being threatened. So for me, it's having a left and a right is part of our success. And I think if just more people would recognize that, and more people will recognize that it is the public discourse, it is us coming together and fighting our ideas that gives us the foundation of our system, I think we'll be much better off. But it seems that not as many people have that perspective nowadays. So I really do appreciate your perspective of having the discourse and having that discussion. Believe it or not, we're over time, way over time.
Wow.
This was a lot of fun. There's so many more things that I could go into here, but we just don't have the time. There's one question I ask all of our guests, and it's if you had to go back, and it's a personal question, and we've done a fair amount of that today, so it should be no surprise, but it's a hard question because it's a personal question. If you had to go back to 20-something-year-old Les, what would you advise him?
First thing I would do is something I didn't learn until my late 20s, is I would exercise every day. And my mental health, my mood swings were completely moderated once I started working out. So that's the first thing I would do. If I could do it all over again, I think I would try to learn how to write sooner, to have a better balance between sort of activism, organizational stuff, and writing. Not an academic writer. I was not meant to be an academic. I tried. I mean, I really did try in graduate school. Went to a really good program at Princeton. I have had great professors and all that, but it wasn't really for me. So I think I would just try to have a better balance between activism and writing, even if the writing was difficult and I had to get somebody to help me check the spelling.
God bless Grammarly, and now ChatGPT does a wonderful job in fixing spelling. So I have a little bit of dyslexia myself, so I appreciate the
You're welcome.
technology that has come along. Les, thank you so much for joining the show today. We're very happy to have you.
Thank you, Ari. It's really been a pleasure.